science and spirituality aren't actually opponents? What if they're just both pointing towards the same truth, that everything is connected in ways that we don't yet understand? Lately, I've been going down some rabbit holes that connect ancient civilizations, consciousness science, psychedelics, and artificial intelligence. And the deeper I go, the more I keep coming back to this very question. I grew up as someone with a very healthy respect for the sciences. My father was an engineer, my mother was a high school biology teacher, and I was never drawn to the fundamentalist biblical interpretation of Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. The idea that faith requires distrusting reason and evidence or intellectual inquiry has just never sat right with me. But as someone who's built a career around the humanities, I find myself equally skeptical of a purely materialistic worldview. The assumption that reality is limited to what we experience with our senses, what we can directly observe, measure, and quantify. And the further along I get, the more I wonder if both of these perspectives are simply missing something. So recently, I listened to two very different podcasts. One featured Graham Hancock talking about ancient civilizations like he does. The other features science writer Michael Pollan discussing consciousness science with Ezra Klein. And at first glance, these two podcasts had nothing in common. But by the end, both of them seem to be pointing towards the same conclusion. Reality may be just far more mysterious, interconnected, and difficult to categorize than we currently understand. So let's start with Graham Hancock. Now, whether you think he's right about Atlantis or some other lost civilization isn't really the part I'm interested in. What captures my attention is much simpler. It's the question beneath his work. How often have we been wrong about what we thought we knew? Our understanding of human history has changed dramatically just in the past 40, 50 years. Hancock points out that when he began exploring the question decades ago, many scientists believed that anatopically modern humans have only been around for 50,000 years. But today, the evidence suggests that modern humans have been around for at least 300,000 years. That is a major change to our fundamental understanding of human history. And this isn't an isolated incident. There's been loads of other examples. We once believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. We believed that continents were fixed in place. We believed the Amazon rainforest was largely untouched wilderness until evidence revealed engineered landscapes and extensive settlements hidden beneath the canopy. We believed hunter-gatherers were incapable of large-scale construction projects until sites like Göbekli Tepe challenged those assumptions. Again and again, new evidence forces us to revise what we thought was settled knowledge. And that's absolutely not a weakness of science. That's actually one of its greatest strengths. Science works because it's willing to revise itself. But Hancock raises a question that I do think deserves consideration. What happens when we become so attached to our current models that we just stop asking questions? One of his arguments is that myths, legends, and ancient stories should not automatically just be dismissed as primitive superstition. Now, that doesn't mean that myths are literally true. It doesn't mean every ancient story contains hidden scientific information. But it does raise an interesting possibility that human beings have been trying to understand reality for a really long time. And perhaps some of those stories preserve observations, memories, or insights that we may not have fully appreciated. And what struck me most wasn't Hancock's conclusions. It was just the intellectual humility that underlies that very question. The recognition that there are still mysteries about our past that remain unresolved. And what was funny is that same theme kind of appeared again in the second conversation I listened to, except this time the mystery wasn't about our past, it was about consciousness itself. It was this conversation between Ezra Klein and science writer Michael Pollan, where they end up kind of pointing out a remarkable paradox. Consciousness is the one thing we know more intimately than we know about anything else. Every experience we have is filtered through it, and yet we still don't really understand what it is. We can observe brain activity, we can measure electrical signals, we can identify networks associated with perception and memory and decision making, but none of that truly explains why subjective experience exists in the first place. Why does a collection of neurons produce experience? Why is that what being is? Why do we experience things like wonder or love or fear or awe? Simply by processing information like some kind of computer. Despite enormous advances in neuroscience, that question goes pretty much unresolved. And that matters because we're suddenly living in an age where people are asking whether artificial intelligence might someday become conscious. But how can we even answer that question if we can't even define what consciousness is? The deeper Pollan's conversation goes, the stranger it becomes. Researchers are exploring plant intelligence. I've mentioned anesthesiologist and scientist Stuart Hammerhoff before on this channel, and he's one of the ones at the forefront of this kind of research. And some scientists are studying altered states of consciousness through the use of psychedelics, while some remain committed to materialist explanation. Yet still other scientists are exploring ideas like panpsychism or idealism, frameworks that would have been considered fringe not that long ago. Again, I am not arguing that any of these theories are absolutely correct. What interests me is the fact that serious scientists are still debating really foundational questions. And that should inspire a certain humility. Because if we don't fully understand consciousness, the very thing that we experience reality through, then perhaps we should be cautious about assuming we already understand intelligence, awareness, or existence itself. And this is where I started noticing something interesting. The deeper both conversations went, the more they seemed to circle around a similar idea: interconnectedness. Hancock arrives there through ancient cultures, myths, shared stories. Pollan arrives there through consciousness research, meditation, psychedelic research, and neuroscience. They're very different roads, but they get to a similar destination. In Pollan's conversation, he discusses how psychedelic experiences often create a profound sense of connection to nature, to other people, sometimes to reality itself. And of course, many indigenous and shamanic traditions have emphasized this interconnected view of existence for thousands of years. Many ancient cultures viewed humans not as isolated individuals standing apart from nature, but as participants within a larger living system. And modern science, interestingly enough, keeps revealing its own versions of this interconnectedness. Ecology shows how deeply species depend on one another. Systems theory reveals how small changes ripple through larger networks. Neuroscience increasingly suggests that consciousness is shaped not only by the brain, but also by the body, environment, relationships, and experience. Very different disciplines, very different languages, coming to similar conclusions. Insight that nothing exists entirely on its own. What I found fascinating is that these two very different conversations, which began in completely different places, ultimately do converge on that similar question. Have we become so focused on technological progress and measurable knowledge that we've overlooked forms of wisdom that still have something to teach us? Ancient cultures may not have had MRI machines, particle accelerators, or artificial intelligence. They spent thousands of years exploring consciousness, meaning, ritual, community, symbolism, and humanity's relationship to the natural world. So perhaps the question isn't whether ancient people were right about everything. Lord knows they weren't. Just like we aren't. So perhaps the question is whether modernity has a monopoly on wisdom. I really don't think it does. After all of these rabbit holes, I don't really think I came away with any answers. If anything, I have more questions than when I started. But I find it really interesting that a journalist exploring ancient civilization and a science writer exploring consciousness can kind of arrive at the same place. The recognition that reality may be so much more interconnected, more mysterious, and more alive than we currently understand. So maybe science and spirituality aren't opponents after all. Maybe they're two very different languages describing the same landscape. And if that's true, then curiosity might be one of the most important things we have. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for joining me today. I hope this helps.